Good morning and welcome to the Point. For the first time since being sworn in, President Donald Trump was in Michigan this past week. He was at the old arsenal of democracy, the Willow Run Airport, where new automotive testing will soon begin with autonomous vehicles and more. He talked about the automotive industry, about automotive jobs, and about a new industrial revolution.
I'm sure you've all heard the big news that we're going to work on the CAFE standards so you can make cars in America again. We're going to help the companies and they're going to help you. There is no more beautiful sight than an American-made car. No more beautiful sight. I love this state. I love the people of this state. And you did me a big favor because you gave me a victory, and that victory hasn't been won by a Republican in a long time. Long time. And you're going to be very happy, believe me. You're going to be very, very happy. During the campaign, I came to Michigan again and again, and I made this promise that I am going to fight for your jobs and fight very, very hard. I'm going to fight for Michigan workers. I'm going to fight to keep the automobile production in the United States of America, not outside, in the United States. And by the way, for those that have any doubts, many other industries too. That's okay, right? So we're here not simply to honor the past, but to devote ourselves to a new future of American automotive leadership. We want to be the car capital of the world again. We will be, and it won't be long, believe me. Now, these hundreds of acres that defended our democracy are going to help build the cars and cities of the future. So I ask you, that's fine, because you're right. So I ask you today to join me in daring to believe that this facility, this city, and this nation will once again shine with industrial might. I'm asking you to place your faith in the American worker and these great American companies. I'm asking all of the companies here today to join us in this new industrial revolution. Let us put American workers, American families, and American dreams first once again. May God bless the American worker. May God bless the Motor City. And may God bless the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
One of the things the president surprisingly did not talk about is the effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Also, he didn't talk about his budget priorities that were released the following day. Those priorities suggest some big cuts for some things here in Michigan that some people think are very vital. We'll be talking about that next week with Democratic Senator Gary Peters. But this morning, we get back to state politics and the Democratic leader in the Michigan State Senate, Senator Jim Ananich. We talked to him about the Democratic priorities going forward and how things are going in his hometown of Flint. Senator, let's talk about a new legislative year. You start with more or less a clean slate. We know that there are certain things that have to be done. We've already seen the governor's priorities, and he's laid out some thoughts about what he wants to do. But in the broadest sense of the terms, what would you and your Democratic colleagues like to get accomplished in this next 2 years?
I think that's a good question, and that's some things we've been kind of talking about as a caucus. And I have a good relationship with the Speaker, the Minority Leader in the House, and of course the Majority Leader. That's it's well reported on our relationship. And obviously, personally, and I think the caucus as well, there's still some work to do on Flint, and not just on the funding side of it, but what we saw happen in Flint we need to make sure this never happens anywhere ever again. And so there's some rules now I think we need to pass. The Child Leadhood Prevention Commission, lead and copper rule changes, some of those things that we make sure that we protect everybody, and that if an incident happens, under current law you can wait 30 days before you have to inform somebody. That's way too long for someone to be ingesting lead. So I think that'll be some of the things that we'll be pushing. I think that should be done in a bipartisan way, and I'm hopeful that it will be. The joint committee that I was on made a number of recommendations, the governor's task force, and it's pretty well agreed upon. And really, if you think about it just from a practical standpoint, aside from the human element of it, which is what I deal with every day, of course, but we've spent close to $500 million, fixing a problem that never should have happened in the first place. That we've seen all the failings that happened, and we don't need to rehash those. But if you're a taxpayer in the state, I think two reasons you want to see it done. You want to make sure that the horrible thing that happened to Flint doesn't happen to anyone else, and that your tax dollars are used wisely. Because if it happens again in another community, we could have solved it. Shame on us. So I'm hopeful that we really work on that. Obviously, during the campaign, President Trump hit on a lot of angst that people have in Michigan. A lot of folks feel that they're not recovering, that they're not a part of this recovery. So I think we need to do more to make sure that families feel part of the recovery. One of the bills I just introduced and worked with my colleagues is the Earned Sick Days bill. I think a lot of folks have to choose between taking care of themselves, their loved ones, their parents, their children, and losing a paycheck. And that's an issue that I think the president's talked about it somewhat at the national level. It's happening around the country. I think it's good for the employee and it's good for the employer. So a lot of things that affect working families, making sure that they feel a part of. I think I've said this before in the show. Most people, they wake up on Monday morning, they want to work the week, and feel like they're not worse off at the end of the week. And a lot of people just don't feel that way. So we have to do more, without adding some bunch of new government programs, but just making sure that we're helping people empower themselves to do better. And I think that's some of the things we'll be working on, and hopefully we can do it in a bipartisan way.
Well, let's pick up with what we were talking about in terms of Flint, because obviously it is a big state issue. I think you make an interesting point. It first and foremost, and most importantly, is a human tragedy. But as a consequence of that, a lot of taxpayer resource has gone into a city that, by the way, is going to need more money to recover.
No question
so
about it.
let's talk about some of those things. You talked about a new lead and copper rule. This is something that the governor has also talked about.
Yes.
And that is a rule that is, generally speaking, established at the federal level. So is it your thought, and I know you've introduced something, that we would do something here at the state of Michigan that would, if I'm not mistaken, I think the governor said it was a stupid rule, the way it was written.
Dumb and dangerous.
Dumb and
That's
dangerous.
his term. Yep.
So we would step away from the federal rule and have our own here in the state?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Basically, the lead and copper rule, I've testified in Washington about the failings of the lead and copper rule, and obviously I'd like to see them change it there nationally so that this happens across the country. But I have more control, obviously, at the state level. And my colleagues here in the Senate and, of course, in the House and the governor do too. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we have a rule that fits Michigan. We have the most fresh water of anywhere in the world. We have lakes and rivers and obviously the Great Lakes, and we need to protect those. And we need to make sure that we have all this fresh water, that people all across the state have access to it. And we should make a Michigan lead and copper rule that protects everyone. And we can do that in a way that I think makes sure that we protect people, make sure people are informed about the quality of their water, and they can make decisions based on that. And we're going to have to do some infrastructure spending. That's nationwide. And I think we need to get a hold of that and start working on that. It's one of the reasons I voted against the roads plan last year, because I knew that a lot of it was sort of smoke and mirrors. They're already talking about taking that $600 million that they were going to use from the general fund. That's probably going to go away at the rate they're going. And the plan is it was a massive increase in taxes, and there's going to be no roads fixed. We have to be serious about it, and we need to start looking underground and on the roads. And I think we can do that if we're really willing to have that tough conversation. But taxpayers across the state, they put their hearts and their minds and their prayers for the people of Flint, and many donations. But we need to make sure that when we use their tax dollars, it's used effectively, and that it's not repeated all across the state, and those mistakes aren't made again. And I think we can do that by passing some of these bills that we're talking about.
I want to talk more about Flint, but I want to move to something you just touched on. You were talking about infrastructure, both above and underground. We were told it would be $1.2 billion a year for the next 10 years to try to get roads up to a particular level.
Yeah.
Now we're told it's nearly $5 billion to take care of all the stuff that we don't see underground. There was no consensus to get to $1.2 billion, or at least it didn't happen in the legislature.
No.
Getting the extra $4.8 billion or whatever it is could be a heavy lift too. What do we have to do? What do you have to do in the legislature to get colleagues on both sides of the aisle to say, hey, look, this isn't something that we can't do. It's something that's going to have to be done. And either we do it, or the next legislature does it, or the next, and it's going to get more expensive as it goes along.
Yeah, I unfortunately, what I think has happened too often in politics, and this state included, I think there's some things we do very well, but there's other things that we don't, is we have to wait for a crisis, right? I mean, I was able to help marshal through substantial resources to Flint to help solve the problems, and we're still not solved yet, but working on getting it better. And that was because a international crisis happened, and it forced people to make the decisions they should have made a long time ago. I'm hoping that we don't have to go I'm hoping we don't have to go down that road for everything else. But you're seeing more traffic deaths every year now. If you look at the MDOT statistics, every year it gets worse. The roads, I mean, there's more potholes, and there's areas that aren't potholes. I mean, that's areas, and even in your community too, where I obviously represent Flint, and the majority of your viewership's the west side of the state, and I doubt they feel that their roads are very good, but they've also had their taxes increased, whether it's their registration or their gas tax. And I think people are willing to pay more, but they want to believe that their money is going to where they think it's going towards. If they're said you're going to be raising your taxes to pay for roads, they want to make sure that the roads actually get better. And the unfortunate part is the sort of roads plan that was passed was never going to be enough to cover the roads. And I think the unfortunate part is it was a PR plan versus an actual infrastructure plan. So I'm hopeful that we can have a serious conversation and say, how are we going to do this? Is it a combination of bonding? Is it some private-public partnerships? People should look at the concept of toll roads. All those things should be on the table. I'm not suggesting all those are the answer, but those are things that should be on the table and say, okay, we're going to have to make some tough decisions because people didn't before us. So it's our job when we're here. We took an oath to say we're going to serve the taxpayers. Kicking down the can down the road is not what we're supposed to be doing. So I don't know exactly what's going to need to happen, but I hope it's not a tragedy again. I mean, the sinkhole in Fraser, now that's going to have to be dealt with. There was signs for all these things that never should have happened to make sure it never happened, and we ignored them, right? Or people ignored them, and it's not what we should be doing when we're saying we're going to be responsible.
You talked about the human tragedy that you deal with as an elected member, and not just that, but you live in Flint. You live in one of the older areas that had some of the highest concentrations of lead for a while. So let's start there.
Yeah.
What is the water testing like at your house now?
The water testing at my house, like much of Flint, is improving. When they switched back to the Detroit River water and they added the phosphates, the corrosion control, over time the water was going to get better. I mean, we knew that was going to happen. That was the reason why many of us thought we shouldn't have switched off to Flint, is because we had a good water source, and obviously our concerns were ignored, and in many cases people lied to us. So the water quality is getting better. It's meeting the federal standard, but as you mentioned before, the governor called the federal standard a dumb and dangerous standard. So I think Flint standard should be the highest in the country, and then we should bring everyone up to that. And we're not there yet. So the water quality is improving. There's still hot spots throughout the city. And when you're taking lead lines out, it causes friction and causes problems, and then lead can dissipate, and you can have a low reading one day, and they take a service line out 3 houses down, and you can have an influx. So people in Flint should be using filters for a number of years to come. And I think really, I don't think people need to be worried, but I think every community across the state, especially if you're in an older community, you need to be a little more diligent about testing your water and making sure that you're taking precautions to protect your family, whether you have a well or on a municipal system.
In addition to all of the other efforts that Senator Ananich would like to undertake, he and many of his colleagues this past week were talking about transparency. It was Sunshine Week, so what is that? We'll talk about it when we come back to The Point. Welcome back to The Point. This week we're talking about the priorities for the Democrats in the Michigan State Senate. You'll recall last week we talked with Senator Arlen Meekhoff. He's the Senate Majority Leader. But this week with Senator Jim Ananich, we're talking about what Democrats would like to achieve. One of the things they'd like is more transparency. There was a lot of conversation about that during this Sunshine Week that just ended. He tells us what he would like to see happen in Michigan. During Sunshine Week, you've been talking a lot about transparency, and we've heard a lot of transparency talk. Last year, the House of Representatives passed a set Freedom of Information Act expansion, sent it down to the Senate. I talked with your counterpart across the hall, Senate Majority Leader. He wasn't interested in those last year, told me last week he doesn't think they're necessary and they create some problems. Same bills are going to be coming back, and in fact there will be some introduced, if they haven't been already, in the Senate by some of your Republican colleagues. So there's that effort, but then there's another effort that you and some of your Democratic colleagues talked about. Tell me what you would like to see done when it comes to transparency. We can talk about the FOIA in a
Sure.
moment, but what were you talking about?
Well, can I talk about the FOIA first
Sure,
a little bit, and then I'll go
absolutely.
back to that? Because, as a resident of Flint, not just the senator, we found a lot of information out when the governor released his emails. A lot of information that showed pretty clearly that folks at highest levels of government knew about the water crisis. And I think if people had access to the ability to FOIA their government, a lot of this never would have happened in the first place. And so I think I have some personal examples of seeing emails that I sent to highest levels of government where they basically responded to me saying one thing that wasn't true, and then they communicated with each other saying, we got to do something about this, but didn't tell the public. So for me, on the FOIA side, I understand the point that the majority leader is making. He makes some legitimate points, and I think openness and transparency is everyone's goal. We go through it about different ways. So I think there's some obvious reasons why getting access to information is important for the public. Some of the things that the Democratic plan, I think, make a lot of sense. First off, I think people need to know that Michigan is consistently ranked the worst state in the country for transparency, for openness in government. And some of the ways you can go about fixing that is personal financial disclosure like you have at the federal level. People need to understand that if I have a business interest, what that is, and am I taking positions, am I introducing bills, am I voting on bills, one way or the other, that could affect me personally, either positively or negatively. I think people have a right to know that. Is there a conflict of interest? Now, we have a responsibility to keep voting on bills because we're sent by our colleagues, by our constituents, to vote on things. That doesn't mean you can't vote on something, but it needs to be disclosed that you have a conflict and that you're actually introducing bills that may or may not affect you. I think that's some of the things that we need to be doing. Obviously, FOIA is another one. And I think some of those examples that we've seen in other states that seem to work could work here in Michigan. I think it's about building back trust. But one of the things that I find it's kind of funny, kind of ironic, is that transparency should be 52 weeks a year. And I think a lot of times it only gets focused on in Sunshine Week. And I'm not blaming reporters. Sometimes it's my colleagues. It's one week a year we go out and talk about how much important transparency is, and the other 51 weeks a year they want to hide everything. Transparency and openness, it's a philosophy. It's a way of governing. It should be 52 weeks a year. And I think until we have that mentality, sometimes it looks more like a show than it does like about actually opening government up.
Let's talk about another initiative I know you're concerned about, and that's
Sure.
the unemployment insurance compensation here in the state. There have been some real problems.
Yeah.
Some of it's computer-based, some of it is application of what the computers were saying. So kind of where are we with that, and what do you think we ought to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think where we're at is we've come together in a bipartisan way, which is good. I mean, I've been working on this for a long time just as a senator because it felt like a one-off. You're talking to constituents. I knew some of them personally, and $20,000, $25,000 in fines, penalties, interest, and it seemed like this is crazy. They didn't do anything wrong. And then you have another case, and you think, and it's one of those things where we're collegial, we talk a lot, but we never talked about that because maybe we could have headed it off a long time ago because every senator, every rep's had this problem because it's so many people. So now it's stopped. It won't go forward, and now it's the process of making sure we make people whole. There's a little bit of disagreement about that. To me, if someone went through bankruptcy, they lost their job, they have tax implications, when the government is solely wrong, and there's no question about that. Nobody disagrees with that. The government is 100% wrong and they stole people's money. We need to make sure we make people whole. If that means we have to provide credit recovery services, we have to go above and beyond. They were forced to go above and beyond. They didn't do anything wrong. So I think that's the least we can do. So we've got some bills being drafted. I'm hoping they're done in a bipartisan way that really creates a fund to go back and make sure everyone, as best as possible, some people have moved or it's hard to find them, maybe someone passed away unfortunately, to the best of our ability. It was like in the high 90%, I think it was the 93, the number that the mistakes were in the 90s percent of people that were told they committed fraud, told they committed a crime, and they didn't.
And let me interrupt there,
Yeah.
just so, because we kind of jumped into the middle for
Sure.
people who weren't impacted and aren't aware, people that were rightfully receiving unemployment insurance.
Yes.
At some point, there was a computer program that said, no, we think this is fraudulent.
Yeah.
Then they would be told, you received your money in error and now we want it back.
Yeah.
Stands to reason that if people are on unemployment, they probably don't have lots of cash reserves
No.
necessarily to pay it back. They were forced to pay it back, and now that's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
making it whole.
And as you said too, when you're on unemployment, you're usually at the bottom, right? You've I mean, even if you did nothing wrong, you still feel like you did, right? I mean, because you lost your job, you feel like, you feel like a failure, right? And then to be told you committed a crime on top of that, and here now give us this money back with interest penalties and all these other things, they just didn't have it. I mean, people's lives were ruined. So we need to make sure we do the best we can to fix that terrible mistake that happened for a number of years. And I think that's the part where we're going to continue to fight and make sure that happens. Now, the one thing that's important to note, though, the Secretary of State's office just recently, within the last week, signed the contract for the same company that was the UII vendor. Now, I would be expecting to get a lot of concessions out of this company that made a huge mistake, and whether it was user error or them, someone should have said 90-some% of the people that were saying have fraud weren't, and they didn't. And now to give them another contract, that's troubling, right? And I think we're going to look into that to see, there's a lot of companies out there, and these folks hurt a lot of Michigan families. That's troubling, and we need to look into that and find out why that happened, and if there's a way to make sure the companies that do damage to Michigan families don't get to keep bidding in Michigan anymore.
When the next 2 years is completed, there are a whole lot of new faces. They're going to be sitting in that chamber upstairs because there are a bunch of folks that are term limited and are going to move on down to another political office, a different career or something. In that period of time, do you think that there is going to be a push to take care of the unfinished business, the things that members that have served in the House and moved on to the Senate haven't gotten done in the however many years they've been here and want to get done now?
Yeah, and unfortunately, they probably want to do it in lame duck. And I think that's, for folks that aren't, it's a terminology obviously people that in this business know. It's a period of time after the election, before the first of the year when the new senators and governor, and in this case, it'll be a new governor, it'll be a new Senate, a new House, get it sworn in. And it's a period of time where a whole bunch of people will be unaccountable. They may never be able to run for office again, or never will run for office again, and they won't be serving. It's a terrible time to pass bills. It's when we pass a lot of bills. And don't get me wrong, I've had bills that I've tried to get done in lame duck. I'm sounding a little bit like a hypocrite, and I'm fine if people feel that way, because to me, we should not be doing that. I operate under the rules that we're playing under, but I think for the interest of openness, transparency, that's a period of time where it should only be emergencies. The governor should be able to call us back if we have an issue like Flint, or an issue like a sinkhole, or a budgetary issue. It should not be time when, because what happens is people say, I'll just worry about it in lame duck. It's controversial, we'll deal with it in lame duck. Well, that by its very nature is a problem, right? If it's controversial, the public has a right to know, and they should hear us debate about it and see, yes, Ananich voted yes or Ananich voted no on this, and they can judge me on that. So I think a lot of that's going to happen. And there's some folks making an argument, and it's a legitimate argument about why we should call it a part-time legislature, and you only operate from the time when we get sworn in till about October, and you only come back if you need to come back. But the committees would work around year-round, and I think there's an argument to be made about that we should only be operating when we can be held accountable. And I'm warming up to that argument.
And speaking of transparency, there were 10 bills over in the State House. They were all about expanding the Freedom of Information Act and other transparency items. They all passed this past week, 108 to nothing. Will they be taken up in the Senate? A similar group of bills that passed last year got no action. When we come back, we'll have more to the point. So the legislative process continues, both in Lansing and in Washington. On the national level, there is still that effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. But now the president has laid out his budget priorities, or at least some of them, and the attention from many lawmakers is about what things he would cut. Next week on this program, we'll talk with Democratic U.S. Senator Gary Peters about that and more. And join us Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for To the Point.